Can you hear me?
Yeah, sounds
Yes?
like it's on.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the session. I have two wonderful writers here to discuss their work and within the Jamaican context. Kai Miller, who has written a book of short stories, a book of essays, two novels, and 4 collections of poetry. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
And the last one, the cartographer tries to map a way to Zion, won the Forward Prize in 2014. And we have Marlon James, who has written 3 novels, the last one of which, A Brief History of 7 Killings, won what is possibly India's most favorite literary award, the Booker. And I want to mention just one other name, which is Claudia Rankine, whose book Citizen sold over 100,000 copies and won several prizes, and is also of Jamaican. And I just think something is happening in Jamaica. The world has suddenly woken up. It's been happening probably, but suddenly the literary world has woken up to it. So I wanted to start off by asking you, Kai, if you could explain the concept of Zion, because you have it in your title, and also growing up in India, I think we have a sense, mainly from Boney M and Bob Marley and some vague references to the Bible, but really to understand in a Jamaican context, what does Zion mean and where does it sit in the consciousness?
Well, that's a kind of hard thing to go into, because it's not so much how does Zion fit into a Jamaican context, which it does among several church cultures, but specifically how does it fit into a Rastafari context. And in a Rastafari context, Zion is everywhere but Jamaica. So in Rastafari culture and in Jamaican culture as a whole, that we've used the Bible to understand who we are, and so oftentimes they understand themselves, or we understand ourselves as people who've been taken away from home. So we are the children of Israel. We are captive. We exist in a strange land, and where we definitely want to go to is out of this strange place. And so Rastafari, they capture this concept of Zion as a place, a kind of, the place where all of this, all of colonialism ends, all of the badness that comes with that, all of the looking down on people because of the color of their skin, because of how they talk. And Zion is a place where everything suddenly becomes equal. And so Jamaica is, in Rastafari imagination, Jamaica is the opposite of Zion, and everywhere that we get to.
Is that still something that, will people still talk about, will they still mention, will they still say Zion when they're talking?
Oh, yeah, man. Yeah, definitely.
Okay. And Marlon, I wanted to ask you about the flip side of that, I guess, in a way, and maybe I'm making a mistake, but when I'm reading the work, sort of Babylon is the other word that comes up, and that seems to me kind of the opposite.
It's Jamaica.
It's Jamaica, okay.
Yeah, Jamaica is Babylon. So yeah, and Brief History is pretty much a book about Babylon. And the sort of trials and tribulations and violence and just the ridiculous contradictions of living in this sort of post-colonial, post-independence society. By the 70s, I think a lot of the ideological the sort of dreams we had about Jamaica were not necessarily dead, but dying in a way. And but at the same time, it was also the rise of this very, very sort of internationally savvy artistic consciousness at the same time. So it's sort of trying to make sense of all of that. But my novel is pretty much, describing the world that the person in Kai's poetry is trying to get away from.
Yeah. And you, contrary to what one Italian journalist asked you, did not grow up in the ghetto.
No.
And had a quite safe and boring sort of, you weren't exposed to danger.
Yeah, I think
I grew up in the ghetto. He was.
Yeah, that's true. He's rough and tumble. Yeah. Yeah, I think people forget just how much of an artistic motivator boredom is. You really, I don't know if you need more than that. It's like, you know, I was saying yesterday, Terry Tempest Williams says she writes because she wanted to have more than one life. And yeah, because after a while you get tired of watching Sesame Street, I guess. You want to have more than one life.
But you also said that you wrote this book, you would not have been able to write this book if you hadn't left Jamaica.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to ask about that journey out, I guess, this idea of, you know, what was your childhood like? How did you feel connected to the world? And when did the sense of wanting to leave Jamaica kick in?
I don't know. For me, I mean, a lot of the wanting to leave Jamaica came down to actually very practical reasons. I needed a job. It's my friend. My friend at the time was the chair of the English department at UA, and I said, "Hey, what would it take for me to get here?" She says, "Well, either one of us need to die, or you become too big a writer to ignore." So some of it was just practicalities. I think if you want to live the writing life, which for most writers means teaching with some writing in it, you'll search for those opportunities. So some of it was on a very practical level. But I also feel, and I think it's changing in the Caribbean. It's certainly changing in Trinidad. That the sense that if I wanted to be a successful writer, whatever that might mean, artistically, and of course commercially, and be in a sort of world of letters and world of active writing, participating writers, that I had to leave. And I think hopefully I think it's changing, but I don't know.
Kai, what was your experience? Because you left home fairly early.
No.
You left pretty late.
Marlon and I left at the exact same year, did the exact same kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so no, I lived in Jamaica. It's just that Marlon is older than me, so you know, it seems
I like this as senior.
No, so I left when I was 28, and lived in Glasgow for about 7 years, and then last year I moved to London. And yes, it was the same motivations. Just probably in a very practical way. I did the strange thing of moving to England rather than the States, where most Jamaicans these days would move to. And it was simply a matter of following my books. So my books migrated long before I did, and they had set up residence in publishing houses in London. And after a while, you just kind of followed behind. Because, you know, it was a weird life. A book would come out, I'd go to London for a week and give a reading and come back to Jamaica. And, you know, I moved to where my books had moved to before.
Do either of you have a Caribbean publisher?
That, what? Sorry.
Sorry, I didn't plan to laugh that loud.
Okay.
You know what, I mean, and also not to mock some of the work that's really being done. I think People Tree Press is doing some wonderful work.
Yeah, but
People Tree is a British publisher.
Yeah, they are. Akashic is doing great work. Akashic is an American
publisher.
So even what we call Caribbean publishers, they're not based in the Caribbean. So we laugh because there's no such thing. Really,
Yeah.
Really? There's no Caribbean publishers?
I mean, there are people publishing books in the Caribbean,
Okay.
but that's not necessarily the same thing.
Right.
And I think to an extent that sometimes I think where I find good work being done in Jamaica and publishing literature is actually children's literature and young children's literature, like kindergarten and younger. I think there's some serious attempts there to do some good work. Other than that, it's not really, and I think I don't think we ever thought for a second that as writers we'd end up having a kind of sustaining career
Right.
in Jamaica.
So the journey out is, if you want to write, is pretty much you have to leave.
Yeah, it's a very practical thing, and you know, so some of those things are, you know, it's not because the Caribbean is an anti-reading culture. I mean, it might be, but I mean, those aren't the reasons. It's very practical things. We're an archipelago of islands. Some islands have a population of 50,000 people, some less. You know, you get Jamaica, which is almost 3 million. But when you're talking about distributing books across several different islands, shipment, and you know, just getting that critical mass, it's just not possible to have Penguin Caribbean in the way that you have Penguin India.
Yeah.
We just don't have those kind of numbers to sustain it.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. I actually have a book published in the Caribbean.
By who?
By a publishing house called Nehesi Publishing House. Do you know it?
Oh, St. Martin. And yeah. That's
No, so
true.
I just asked because I was curious about how those dynamics work. But
Yeah.
anyway, I won't say that you laughed loudly when I asked
Yeah.
the question. I also want to know more about this journey out because when I was reading Kai, one of your essays about watching the Beijing Olympics and watching Bolt and hearing a Jamaican woman, and you said there was this sense of forgetting where you were. You were in Glasgow, but you suddenly thought that you were in Jamaica. And you talk about code switching. You had this lovely piece where you wrote about how you would go to New York and feel closer to the idea of yourself, and then you once forgot to change out of your skinny jeans before going to Jamaica. And I just want to, if you could both address this sense of, I guess this sense of displacement in a way, and how it connects maybe to your writing.
I'm not sure. I mean, it is something that fascinates me. When you move from other places, how do you observe those other places? Perhaps one of the things that strikes me, and probably will strike a lot of you for a while, is I become fascinated. So all of us, or many of us, come from places that had been colonized by the UK. So it's fascinating to me that in every city there's always a Queen Street and a King Street.
In a Duke Street.
And Duke Street and Victoria,
Kingston
Corner,
and Portsmouth.
Yeah, and you go through all of these things, all these places, and you realize there was this sudden moment when I appreciated that when I look around Kingston and all these streets, all of the names, that it was an attempt to remember a place, that Kingston is London insufficiently imagined. This will always happen, that the colonists will try, it's when memory becomes active and you try hard to remember this place that you've left, but the landscape always resists this memory. There's this wonderful place in New Zealand called Dunedin, which is the Gaelic word for Edinburgh. And in Dunedin, basically what they've done is that they've taken the map of Edinburgh and they've put it on New Zealand. And of course, there are lakes where there should be mountains, and there's the landscape is always resisting these things. So I think I've just been fascinated by that, and that's always fueled my writing. The ways in which, for instance, Kingston, as I said, is London insufficiently imagined. But when I go to Brixton, I realize that Brixton is Kingston insufficiently imagined, and so it's London returned to itself, but displaced and refractured. And I just wonder, how do places trade imaginations and imagine themselves and become different things by this constant refraction? And I think that constantly comes up in my writing, how places just try to remember other places and they don't do it well enough, but something else is formed. And that's kind of magical, I think.
Yeah. I think if you are a person in the diaspora, code switching is just a fact of life, I think. And not necessarily has to be around gender, identity, or sexual orientation. When I remember the first time I met my brother in New York, I had no idea he had a New York voice. And when he'd be at work talking to his manager, it would be something like, I'll go, what is water? What is that? It never occurred to me. And to the point where he went from deliberately doing it to not even knowing when he's doing it. And I think to be kind of in this diaspora, you do code switch. And for me, especially when I was struggling with sexual orientation and all these other identities that I'm embracing. But the funny thing about being in being in a diaspora is that in a lot of ways, the Jamaican is more Jamaican in New York.
Yeah.
And you can almost smell the hard effort to try to stay Jamaican, including keeping the prejudices. So I'd stay in the Bronx and go to Manhattan. And what I'd do, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the essay, is I would dress in my Bronx clothes, which would look sort of roughneck and hip hop and sort of Jamaica approved clothing. And I'll take the train, and I went all the way down to Union Square. I'd go into the Barnes & Noble bookstore bathroom, lock it, change into my sort of alternative rock clothes, which just means, and run around New York. And I remember the one day I ended up in the Bronx, and I didn't change. I was like, oh my God, they're gonna think, who is this homo walking all the way to this house? After a while, it just becomes, it certainly really drove me mad, I think, because it's this sort of trying on versions of yourself. But I also think it's not necessarily confined to people caught in gender or sexuality or so on. It's to be sort of loose and unmoored as a diaspora person is trying on versions of yourself, I think.
Yeah. And it comes back to me to the person desperately trying to remember the country that they've forgotten, and it means that they hold on to old prejudices, because that's saying as. So I often think that if you really want to research what Jamaica in 1950s was like, don't go to Jamaica, go to Brixton. Because here people are trying so hard to hold on to that thing, and the clothes is the same, the dialect is the same. It hasn't moved on because they need to hold on to this thing that Jamaica once was, whereas in Jamaica, because you're in Jamaica, you don't have to hold on to anything.
Yeah.
The culture can move because you're always Jamaican, but all of a sudden you go to these places and they are much more homophobic, much more intolerant. I mean, they just police Jamaicanness in a way that Jamaica wouldn't police it. Because they have to hold on to this thing. So they look on the clothes you wear, they look on, all of these things that they say, you can't do these things because Jamaica is this solid, stuck thing.
I think it's sort of relevant for a lot of immigrant communities, certainly Indians as well. They sort of hold on to the tradition very close. I wanted to ask about accent as well, because it struck me when I was reading your biographies that you both chose places with very strong accent. I mean, you're in Fargo land, and you were in Glasgow, and these are two very strong accents. So when you were talking about resisting the landscape, did you feel when you went to this place that you did have to, like, hold on to your voice in some way?
Sometimes, including the water thing. Because I remember the first time I said it, I was with one of my best friends who's also Jamaican. And we're at a restaurant, and it's like, hey, would you like a wine? I said, no, I'll just have a glass of water. And we both looked at each other in horror. It's like, what did you just do? It's like, I mean water. Horrified. It was because I'm like, oh my God, I'm gonna lose it. I'm gonna lose it. And I can hear it even now. But at the same time, I think the second I hang around Jamaicans, it just comes back.
Yeah. And surely maybe being a writer allows you to explore all these different voices. Because when I was reading your books, Kai's book has a Rastaman and it has a cartographer. And the Rastaman has a definite voice and the cartographer has a definite voice. And they're both kind of your voice in a way.
Yes, exactly.
They're parts of you. It's a divided self. And Marlon, well, you've got, schizophrenia. It's like there's about 70 different voices. So I wanted to ask about how you negotiate that. So for instance, how did you get into all these different voices? And how did you switch between them?
Well, in a very, very practical way, I only worked on one voice per day. Because with this book, a huge part of this book, writing this book, was just sort of sitting still and figuring out what this character wants. And not necessarily what they want in the terms of the overall plot, but what do they want today? One of my favorite scenes was one of my characters sitting down, noticing that she prefers this TV star's hair when she's playing a cop than when she's playing a diva in a soap opera. And just sort of inhabiting those voices. But that is one in which I got through writing so many. But I think in a lot of ways, I don't try to write myself into my stories, but I think my worldview spills out quite a bit. Like a lot of what my character Nina Burgess says is really me. Because this way she skewers a lot of the hypocrisies of Jamaican society, even though she can't transcend them herself. So a lot of that, a lot of that is me, but a lot of it was just being very disciplined. But also, I had to actually sometimes put up charts on the wall. This person is long-winded. This person never gets to the point. This person is too sarcastic. Another thing that I hope came through in the book is Jamaicans are actually obsessed with speech. We're obsessed with who speaks good and who speaks bad.
And you have Josie Wales, who's a gangster who doesn't like it when people chat bad.
But he doesn't speak that great either.
No, he doesn't.
So those are some of the sort of in-jokes, I guess, that Jamaicans would get. Yeah.
Kai, do you want to tell us about the sort of the relationship between the Rastaman and the cartographer and just how that came about? And
sure. I mean, as you said, I mean, probably more than Marlon, because it would be schizophrenia if this was Marlon writing different versions of himself. But probably for me, more obviously, the cartographer and the Rastaman are different versions. I mean, what's interesting to me is so the book is it pretends that a cartographer has ended up in Jamaica and is mapping out the roads, and he ends up in a very, very contentious conversation with a Rastaman who pretty much disagrees with everything the cartographer says. When the book came out, I mean, I still had long dreadlocks like Marlon's here. So when I read from it in England, everyone assumed naturally that I was the Rastaman complaining to the kind of colonial cartographer. And as soon as I went to Jamaica and read it, everyone in Jamaica immediately knew I was the cartographer. And it's because different things betray me. My middle-class accent betrays me in Jamaica in a way that it doesn't betray me in the UK. And everyone there knew who I was. And I guess that was, that speaks to some of the ways in which I was trying to get these two voices. So the Rastaman speaks, I mean, I was just looking up a lot, listening to Bob Marley a lot, reading Rastafari's speech a lot, and trying to develop this very creolized voice on the page. But I was trying to do different things. So the Rastaman does have some of my biography. He has a PhD from Glasgow, which the cartographer doesn't realize at first. So though he's speaking this really thick Jamaican dialect, he's a lot more educated than the cartographer. And he was trying to just do these weird nuanced things to not make it the kind of typical, the Creole voice represents on education and the Western voice represents education. I didn't want those binaries, yet I wanted two distinct voices. So it's kind of complicated in several ways.
Could we hear those voices? Would you mind reading?
Oh, sure. All right, I'll just read a couple poems back to back. So I pretend sometimes that I'm an academic. Not very good. But one of my most frustrating experiences is going to Jamaica to do some kind of research. And I'm sure you'll have this. When a Jamaican tries to stop anyone and ask them for directions, it can be horrible. And so pretty much in this poem, I've made the cartographer experience exactly what I experience when I visit Jamaica. So I'll just read two poems back to back. So this is number 10 in the sequence, in which the cartographer asks for directions. Sometimes the cartographer gets frustrated when he asks an informant how to get to such and such a place, and the informant might say something like, all right, the big white house at the bottom of Clover Hill with all the windows them board up and with the high shingle roof that look almost like a church? Yes, the cartographer says. And in front of the house, you always see an old woman only 3 teeth in her mouth, and she's out there selling pepper shrimp in a school chair with an umbrella tied to it. And beside her, she always has 2 mongrel dogs, and one of them is white and another one is brown. Yes, I know exactly where you mean, the cartographer says. And in the yard, there's a big guinea tree that hangs right out to the road. It's a school picnic. Always stop there to buy shrimp and eat free guinea. Yes, the cartographer insists. I know it. Good, says the informant, because you must go there. 11, and this poem just follows it. At other times, the cartographer is amazed by the hems and haws and shrugs of our roads, how they never run sure but seem to arc or bend or narrow just so an avenue will turn on itself, as if to give you back a place you have just come from. Lady Musgrave's Road, was laid in its serpentine way so that Miss Musgrave on her carriage ride home would not have to see a nigger man's property so much bigger than her husband's own. She did not want to feel the carriage slow and know her driver had just then turned his face to Devon House, a thing wet like pride in his eyes and nodding to himself, yes, is Miss Astibel that? And to think that such spite should pass down even to the present generation, should dictate the thoughtless, ungridded shape of our city, the slowness of traffic each evening, to think that one woman's pride should add so much to our daily commute. This is something the cartographer does not wish to contemplate. Still, he wonders if on his map he could make our roads a little smoother, a little straighter, as if in drawing he might erase a small bit of history's disgrace.
It's funny because my last address in Jamaica was Lady Musgrave Road.
I was going to ask you about that. I read that somewhere.
I read it for you.
And I'm like, man, poor Lady Musgrave, not realizing that people like me live on her road. All right. So let me read. So I'm just reading a quick section. This character, her name is Nina Burgess, and she's kind of stalking Bob Marley, hoping that he will see her and give her some money to buy a fake visa. But she's been waiting outside the house for all day, and nothing has happened. So 17 buses, 10 minibuses, including one calling itself Revlon Flex that has already passed twice. 21 taxis, 376 cars, I think. And not once did the man step out of his house, not even to get some air, not to make sure the guards are doing their job, not even to tell the son, later, my brethren, I might have serious work to do. The man on the lime green scooter came back in the evening and they sent him away again, but not before he got off and spoke to the man at the gate for 2 minutes and 17 seconds. I timed him. Danny's watch still works, but it wasn't until lunch one time at the Terra Nova Hotel when I ran into a former schoolmate. Her breasts drooped down like a tired goat, but still a stuck-up bitch, that I found out Timex is the same watch that my daddy gave Hortense last week for 15 years of service to the household. This bitch was calling me cheap. I wanted to tell her how happy she must be as a married woman now that she no longer has to bother with looking attractive. But I smiled and said, I hope your little boy can swim because I just saw him running for the pool. Car 367, 68, 69, 71, 72, I need to go home. But I'm outside here waiting on him. You ever feel like home is the one place you can't go back to? It's like you promise yourself when you get out of bed and comb your hair that this evening, when I get back, I'll be a different woman in a new place. I know you can't go back because the house expects something from you. A bus stops, I fan it off, trying to tell the driver I don't want to get on, but the bus is still squatting there, waiting on me. I step back and look down the road, pretending that people aren't in the bus, cussing that them have home forget to, and plenty pitney for feed, so why this damn woman don't get on the bus. I walk away far enough for the bus to drive off. The bass creeps up on me from across the road, and it sounds like he's playing the same song all day. It sounds like another song about me, but there are probably 24 women in Jamaica right now who thinks the same thing anytime a song of his come on the radio. But Midnight Ravers is about me. One day I'm going to tell Kimmy, and she'll know, won't she, that just because she's the prettiest doesn't mean she get all of them. A white police car parks itself by the gate. I didn't even see it coming. Jamaican police tend to use their sirens all the time, just to get people to clear the street so they can get to Kentucky Fried Chicken quicker. I wonder if the guard over the gate is telling the police right at this minute that I've been at the bus stop all day watching the house. But instead, somebody says something, and the fat policeman, there's always one, laughs, and it echoes all the way to the other side. He leaves to get back in his car, but somebody from the inside shouts at him, I know it's you. It has to be you. A car is coming up on my side of the road. 90 feet? I can beat it before it slams into me, and I know it's you. I just know it. The car, 40 feet? Run right now. Don't blow your damn heart at me, you son of a bitch. Deaf like your damn mother. I'm in the median with too many damn cars running around, and I'm in the middle, maroon like Ben Gunn, and I just want you to see me. It's you, it must be you. Remember me? Midnight Ravers is about me, even though it was after midnight, and you might not know what I look like in the day. I just want a favor. I just need a little help. They robbed my father and raped my mother. No, they didn't rape her. No, I don't know. But the story sounds more urgent when you say that. And I know it's you, and the policeman is waiting. Good God, he's coming outside. He's coming outside. It's not you. Another guard runs outside to tell him something, and the fat policeman laughs again and deposits himself in the car. I'm stuck in the median, traffic blurring past me and lifting up my skirt.
Great. Thank you. When you ended that lifting up my skirt, I was thinking of the word that I read in one of Kai's essays, and the word is Berthina. Did I say that right?
Well, how I heard it was Bertina, yes.
Bertina, okay.
I remember this story, don't you?
No, I don't.
And there's this wonderful thing of making up words, because when I was in the Caribbean, I met this lady, and she was talking about her ex-husband, but she called him, he's my husband. And I thought that was so good, just like he's my husband. So anyway, I wanna talk to you both about church, because I know that it's a big deal in Jamaica and that you both have particular experiences. And Kai, you've actually said that if you hadn't entered the church and left it, you might not have become a writer.
Yeah.
So could you talk to us about the church and about writing the sermons and changing your name and all of that?
Yeah. Again, it's one of the weird things that Marlon and I have just scarily similar stories.
We also went to the same high school.
I went to the same high school. Apparently now we know that we need to say with Sean Paul. Went to the same kind of church circle, and I think both at a similar time felt was dissatisfied with what was happening in that kind of charismatic middle-class church circle of Jamaica at that time, and left church and became writers. The particulars for me there was always something about being in church and witnessing people being broken by an amazing preacher being up there speaking. And it always touched me, and it touches me even now. I can still go into that mode and be absolutely amazed by that experience. But when I was sitting in the audience, like you're sitting there, I think what always touched me was language. And what I always began to dissect was what the preacher was doing. And I began to realize small things. I knew that if the preacher put an unlikely verb against a dissonant noun, then the noun would behave differently, and everyone would have goose pimples. And I knew it. I knew how to do it. So that's why when mountains tremble and the moon bleeds blood, a shiver goes across the audience because the noun is behaving in a new way. And what I was learning in the congregation was language and how to use language. Then they made the mistake of asking me to give a sermon at church. And I took this as a literary exercise. I knew what to do. You want me to break an audience? You want the audience to cry? Yeah. Come, bring it on. And so, this to me was my great creative writing experience. I get to compose a sermon, get to compose the moments of quiet. I get to build it. I get to turn nouns with amazing verbs. I get to do it all. And I did it. And there was massive weeping in the church. People were crying, and everyone came up to me afterwards and said, "Oh, God was really moving through you today." And I just remember feeling so guilty, because it's two things happening. One, I'm not snaring at the experience of people being broken. I'm not snaring at the emotional overflow. I completely believe in that experience. But I knew it was writing that led to that. And I couldn't lie anymore. And so for me, writing poetry is about creating those moments. It's about creating a break-in and creating a place where people can come to encounter themselves and be broken and be healed at the same time. And I know that sounds corny, but that's my heritage that comes out of church. And for me, writing was always about creating that, which church taught me how to create, but without the dogma. behind it of the Holy Spirit doing anything.
Marlon, you have a church story that involves Salman Rushdie, and I'd love it if you could tell the audience about it.
Yeah, because I got disillusioned. You know, again, church was safe space, even when I was being disillusioned by it. You know, if Kai and I were in the same church, I would be in the back. Usually, I'd be the person. Not I was in the back. Not I wasn't listening. I'd be the person because the person who shows up and we know they're possessed. So let Marlon deal with that one. So I was like, fine, whatever. I watch horror films. I saw The Exorcist. So I did stuff like that. I also was counting the collection. And when people talk about, the church, they take all your money on a Sunday, I'm like, I've actually counted that collection. Don't flatter yourself. So I remember, and this, and I'm like, thank you, Salman, for my literary crisis. I remember around the same time I was really into church, a friend of mine, I was already writing, trying to write fiction, and a friend of mine gave me a copy of Shame, Salman's novel. And I remember I started reading it and was so thoroughly appalled by it. Because again, and you can testify to this, we had for a very long time a very Dickensian, Victorian kind of idea of literature, which is for the most part what literature shouldn't be. So a novel like that mess with point of view, that telling you which characters are going to die before the characters happen, it would be like, Mr. G, who I will kill on page 22. I was like, you can't do that, you cannot do that. But at the same time, I had that thing that Marquez was talking about when he mentions Kafka about being given permission to write. So I'd be in church, and you know, you have your Bible, but you also have your big Bible bag. So it's a big leather thing. Yeah. And the Bible would be here, and Shame would be here. And the preacher is talking about how we're all going to hell, and I'm reading about Chunny, Money, and Bunny. And it's like, we're going to hell. I'm like, I was like, you're enjoying the damnation of your flock too much, Marlon. I was like, he's pretty much responsible for my being banished from the temple of the Lord.
I think he would like
Thanks,
that,
Salman.
actually. Kai, was there a writer that Marlon mentioned, gave me permission to write? Was there a moment when you felt that you could become a writer, or a writer, or a country, or something that pushed you there?
I know I keep on saying this, but you know how I first encountered Marlon, just by the way? He had come out with his first book, and I was pretty annoyed by this. I read some interview that he had done, and I think my book was like 6 months from coming out, and Marlon, who I'd never heard about in my life, came out with his first novel. But it wasn't just the indignity of him coming out with a first novel. It was that he listed all the writers who were important to him. And he said Salman Rushdie's Shame. That book was important to me, not him. Then he said, Earl Lovelace is the Wine of Astonishment. I was like, no, that's my book. And then to top it off, to complete the triumvirate, he said Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon. And I was just like, freak. And to me coming out 6 months later with that exact list, I'm going to sound like I'm copying him. So, I mean, I invited him over to dinner at my house in Jamaica, and we unfortunately became friends.
That's true.
But it was pretty annoying. So those writers were, all those three writers were pretty important to me. As well, some writers like Olive Senior. I remember being in third form reading Summer Lightning, which is a book that's taught very badly in Jamaica, but it's a book that's desperately dark, and lots of Jamaican books, look at the kind of pastoral, kind of nice rural life. And here's a book that, the opening story is about this pedophile who goes into this village, and it's. But I've always said, oftentimes when I think about your voice or who gives you permission, I think that your voice is composed of so many things, and they're my kind of literary. They're the writers who gave me quote unquote permission, but I think a lot more is in your voice than necessarily people who are consciously writing. So all those preachers in Jamaica are desperately important to what my voice sounds like on the page, because again they were teaching me literary things. All those old women who say strange things. The story that Tishani mentioned is just me being on a bus, and Jamaica has a great tradition of preachers going on buses. And I remember one saying recently, he was chastising these women who dance in certain clubs. And he said, there was this awful woman who he saw, and she was up on the table. Clearly, she didn't have on any panties. And he said, much to his displeasure, when he looked up from the table, he could see, and this is what he said, all the way into her Bertina. Again, just putting words together. And again, that idea of wordplay was amazing, and I think that's part of my voice. So I don't think I would never think of my literary voice as being only a literary construction.
Yeah.
It's much wider than that.
I want to get both of you all to talk about something that maybe you don't agree on, since you've been agreeing on a lot of things, but you wrote an essay in response to something that Marlon had said, which is in defense of Mas Joe. And I think you need to contextualize it a bit, but I do feel that it has a relevance in India because we are constantly having this discussion about authenticity and whose story is it to tell and who gets to write it and folking it up. And you mentioned Arvind Adiga, and that was really the start of this sense of we want that real India, and we don't want the saris and the mangoes, and we want the underbelly. So I want you to sort of just give me that background story about where you stand on that. Marlon.
Oh, I was going to get a few. You want us to slug it out right here? I think it was was Edinburgh. It was a speech I did for Edinburgh Festival. It was at Burgess.
It was at Burgess.
But it was a speech for Edinburgh Book Festival about towards the national literature. And one of the things that I came out against are these sort of literary tropes that like Mas Joe and so on, and something which I took great umbrage to, and that I wasn't interested. I think my bigger point was I wasn't interested in the kind of sentimentality that we see sometimes that we value, and I remember one of your responses was that character is actually not a literary archetype.
Right. And this is going to sound really boring because, again, I think I mostly agreed with Marlon, but I disagreed with how some people were praising what he was saying. And I thought, no, you're praising him for the wrong reason because that's not exactly what he's saying. But there is, I just thought, again, and Indian literature has this, Caribbean literature certainly has it, that, oftentimes, like when White Tiger came out, some of the praise was, here is an Indian novel without the whiff of a mango or without the hint of a sari. And this meant it was finally good, sophisticated, proper world literature. And we said this about the Caribbean as well, that as long as you move away from these cute grandmothers who are wise and any kind of mango trees, any kind of coconut trees, as long as you step away from that, then your work is suddenly validated and it has grit and it's proper literature. And I just insist that you can write about and Marlon puts all of this in the figure of Mas Joe. I just insist that you can write about Mas Joe with complication, and you don't have to romanticize him. Yeah. And there are people who I think are unfairly dismissed because they are looking at Mas Joe, but they're looking at Mas Joe with, incredible complication and depth.
Yeah. And I think that was what I was coming out against, the romanticism.
Yeah.
That it's just too easy. It's too easy. And then, it robs characters of complication. You can make anybody complicated. There's that fantastic story, Chekhov's fantastic story, A Trifle from Real Life, where he just used one line at the end of the story, talking about how Alyosha's entire life is destroyed because he didn't know adults lie. That's it. Immediately, a character who's given one line in a very long story becomes the only character who actually ends a story differently than how he began. There are lots of ways to complicate characters, and I think I was certainly resisting that because it is also a part of a kind of, not necessarily a literary thing, but certainly a Caribbean kind of aesthetic to sometimes latch onto that kind of sentimentality, I think.
Yeah, you had a lovely line, I think it was about why can we not hold an iPad in one hand and a mango in the other, and which I think, I think it definitely applies to Indian writing as well. Just before we open it up to questions, I wanted to ask you in terms of Jamaican literature and Caribbean, I mean, how does that work? Do you feel part of a literary community that is Caribbean, or is it Jamaican, or is it world? How does that? Because one of the things I noticed when I went to the Caribbean is that you can't actually travel between the islands easily unless you fly to America.
Yeah.
And I thought that was strange, and it seemed a kind of metaphor to me that we go through the publishing houses in New York to read the people who are our neighbors, basically.
I suspect this might be another area in which we might slightly disagree. I'm not sure, I suspect. So I definitely see myself as a Caribbean writer. Probably more than a Jamaican writer. I see myself as belonging to that slightly larger community. And I've always been conscious of how my work is in conversation with other Caribbean writers. But then that insistence comes from another strange place. I know that there are definitely Caribbean writers who insist on being writers. It's kind of James Baldwin, a black writer can only write about black things. A Caribbean writer can only want to write about Caribbean things. So can't you imagine yourself as bigger than that? And then I've always strangely insisted that you can write a large literature from a small place.
Yeah.
And anyone who thinks that it is limiting to be only a Caribbean writer, that just gets in my craw. And I go, no, I am a So I mean, we're talking about, Marlon was telling me recently about a Jamaican reader who asked me, oh, you're setting your next book outside of Jamaica, isn't that selling out? Which, I mean, who has the patience for that question? But sometimes I get the question of, oh, when are you finally going to write about something other than Jamaica? As in, when am I going to write a proper novel or a proper book of poems? And then I like dig my heels and I'm not done with Jamaica yet. Or the Caribbean.
Marlon?
I don't think we disagree, but I know I had to come to that realization that I'm a Caribbean writer and a writer in the Caribbean, and the bulk of the stuff I write about still reflects that reality, even though I'm sort of branching all out of it now. But I even remembered the first time I said, I didn't at one point I didn't even want to be a black writer. I just said, can I just be a writer? And I remember a Trinidadian writer, actually, Elizabeth Nunes, said, you might want to put a sock in that. and she went into the whole, how much of the literary consciousness that even in the diaspora came out of us being inspired and even imitating African American literature, like Baldwin, and what a crucial role that played in the growth of our sensibility. And I also agree with Kai that it's not a subject matter. You can write about anything. If a Nicholson Baker character can sit in a chair and think about sex for an entire novel, you can pretty much do anything. And I think there is a kind of universality of experience that you can imbue anything in. I mean, if John Steinbeck can write The Pearl, why can a Caribbean writer write about whatever? I think that you can have. I've read 1,000-page novels that are the most narrow-minded things I've ever come across. And I've read novels, I was talking yesterday about exhaustively researched bad novels. No, I won't be naming names, I already did that.
Okay, all right. Yeah. I'm going to open it up because we have 10 minutes, so if you have questions, I think there's someone with the mic. There's a man over there.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Murray Mccartney. I'm a publisher from Zimbabwe. When our guests started talking about the diaspora, it seemed they focused on Minnesota, Glasgow, and Brixton, and these will have resonances for lots of Zimbabweans. In fact, Brixton is even called Harare North amongst people. My question follows a point that Marlon made yesterday about working or beginning to work on a novel that would be set in Africa. You talked about the UK and America. What's the relationship of Diasporan Caribbeans with Africa? Well, your relationship with it?
I don't know. In some ways, it's an old relationship and a new one. It's interesting talking to somebody like Igoni Barrett, who lives in Nigeria but whose father is Jamaican, and talking to Kwame Dawes about his parents and so on. And I think that for all sorts of reasons, that link between say, African literature and Caribbean literature sometimes gets underplayed. You know, Things Fall Apart was a shot heard around the world for every writer of color, everywhere. The instant sense of limitless possibility that novel gave everybody is something I think we can't deny. At the same time, I don't think I developed a kind of stronger idea of how much I'm playing in an African aesthetic until I went to Nigeria a few years ago. Or even talking to Ghanaians who are shocked how much Twi and Fulani and so on we still speak in Jamaica. So I think on one hand, there's an assumed link because of all the literature that has gone before, but I also think there's not necessarily a severed link, but I think there's a lot we need to know about where we are now that I really did not know until I went to Nigeria. I think, and they didn't know either that that I have a sort of sentimental education of Africa and of Nigeria. I can't speak for Africa; it's a continent. That I think that kind of link is something that I never really thought about until I actually went to African countries and realized that beyond just thinking about it in a systematic way, that I wasn't as connected as I thought I was.
There's, by the way, I mean, something that I recognize now, a way in which I answered the original question badly. In Rastafari culture, Zion is not just anywhere, Zion is Africa. And so Zion is that connection. It's not just an airy-fairy thing. They do want to move back. If you read Erin McLeod's book, which recently came out called Visions of Zion, it's a book about Jamaicans returning to Ethiopia, which is really well researched and a really profound thinking about diaspora in that other way and what does it mean to return and how do those visions, how are they corrupted, just what happens with that kind of migration. So yeah. But by the way, I mean, I grew up, obviously in the Caribbean, we think about Africa, well not obviously, but we do. But I was never an Africanist in any way. But my first time in South Africa, I remember the immigration officer looking at my passport and he said, "Oh, you're Jamaican." And he said, "Welcome home." And I immediately wanted to cry, and I've never felt that. Yeah. Which is completely wrong geographically, because I come from West Africa, but still, I just thought, back in Africa.
There's a question way back over there, the orange kurta.
My question is to Marlon. Did you have, as a writer, did you have a plot or a structure or an alternative narrative genre in mind when you wrote A Brief History of Seven Killings?
The genre...
Because, I mean, sorry to interrupt you, but you did get your 72 rejection slips. So did you have to decode yourself? Did you have to explain yourself considerably? And if so, what was it? I'm curious.
Well, I mean, this book wasn't rejected. It was my first novel. To go back to your initial question, yeah, my original idea was to write a crime novel. Because I'm hugely inspired by crime fiction. Some of my favorite writers are James Elroy, Patricia Highsmith, and I always come back, two things I always come back to when I'm writing novels is crime fiction and Greek tragedy. And so, but for this novel, again, because there's so many characters there, I do plot. I'm a big believer in plot. When I come across people who dismiss plot as if it's some sort of inferior form, I say, I'm going to tell you my Robert De Niro story. So Robert De Niro can do a lot of things very well, but there are two things he can't do. He can't do funny and he can't do sexy. But he's managed to convince you that neither is important. That's how you sound when you talk about plot. Just because you can't do it doesn't mean it's not important. So I'm a big plotter, but I will outline things right down to a T, but here's the crucial part, then I promptly ignore it. And I realized that I use plotting as a way of just clearing my headspace, of sort of having things on the, I really sometimes need to get things out of my head and somewhere else. So that architecture, I'll sometimes just put it on the wall. And it's there if I want to go back to it. But from that, it actually gives me the freedom to spring in all sorts of directions. Because usually my rule when I'm writing a chapter is, at the end of the day, I need to say, I didn't see that coming. And if that doesn't happen, I just keep writing until it does. So I believe in structure, but I use it as just something to sort of keep me sane, as opposed to doggedly following it to go from story as a sort of sequence.
Kai, you write fiction too, so what's your sort of, do you have a similar process, different?
Oh, I think I'm Robert De Niro.
You're Robert De Niro. I'm with you there. Any other questions?
You're pretty funny.
There's a question right here.
Hello, Marlon. My name is Bhaskar, and I have been following you for a long time. And in your interviews, you say that you don't trust facts, but you trust rumors. So there was one quote by David Mitchell's book, Cloud Atlas, there that truth is singular, and all its versions are mistruths. So a rumor can have a 1,000 variations. So how do you trust a rumor but not a fact?
Well, I'm just talking primarily in the Jamaican context. Even when talking about this book, I really didn't care about who wrote an essay or a paper or a news report, only in the context to now find out what their bias was. I'm more interested in what the person across the street can tell me. The great thing about writing about Bob Marley is that, if you want Georgie, who made the firelight in No Woman No Cry, you go to the street where he lives and say, because he's still there. So I just gotta ask him. A lot of the turning points in the novel happen from me just getting the right people drunk. And so tell me about this. Why was Marley talking to these people? I said, they wanted to start a government. I'm like, really? I didn't read that anywhere. I read it later in later documents, but a lot of the really, really juicy, crucial, strange, weird parts of the novel. There's a scene in it where police are investigating these men and investigating for rape, and the only way they investigate is have them all demonstrate how they'll have sex. That's something that I heard somebody say. I did the same thing. I take buses for stories, and I just write. I remember I came on the bus and this person immediately said, yeah, it was like when me and my mom and my aunt went to go get my abortion. I'm like, oh my God. I was like, so I think as a novelist, I'm still ultimately inventing, and in a way I'm ultimately lying. And I'm also attracted to invention. But also just in Jamaica, I just trust what Master Joe tell me more than the official version of the story. Yeah. I think that's how, that's how information is passed. It's part of it is the grand tradition of orality, I think. But I think also I trust the human voice.
Yeah. But a white Canadian anthropologist who is, a very big lecturer in Jamaica, and was doing lots of work there, and I trusted him as a kind of mentor. I remember there was some very scandalous story about some politician who had gotten some teenage girl pregnant. And I asked this friend, who lived in Jamaica, but had all kinds of ways that made him outside, but is friends with all the politicians. So I asked him, is this true? And he sat me down and he just gave me a lesson about, let me tell you how you know what rumors are true in Jamaica, and why does information pass along these channels, not in the major news sources, and how do you learn to trust these rumors? And after that, I realized that, there's a way of hearing in Jamaica that doesn't happen in the newspapers, it doesn't happen, on radio programs, but you hear it and you know that these stories are true. So you learn to trust it after a while. Yeah.
Great. I think we're out of time. Thank you so much, Marlon James and Kai Miller.
Thank you.
We wish to thank our speakers, Kai Miller, Marlon James, and Tishani Doshia. They'll all be signing their books outside the venue at the book signing area. So if you have your books, please line up there. And if you want to get one, please go to the festival bookstore and grab a copy. Thank you. Someone has left their mobile phone here. There's a mobile phone here with a blue cover.